So welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be with you all for this program this evening, and always an honor to partner with Israel Policy Forum. So for those of you that I don't know, my name is Rori. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council here in St. Louis, and we are thrilled to partner with the Israel Center at the Jewish Federation and our partner Karen Rader there, and with Israel Policy Forum to put together this program to start talking about what we're going to be expecting coming up soon with the next round of Israeli elections. As a little bit of housekeeping, for those of you who would be interested, there is a live transcript. So somewhere at the bottom of your screen, you can click on a button, and I don't promise it's always accurate, but there is a transcript, especially because I know I can get really excited and start to talk really fast. So that is an option available. And we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to be posing questions to David in a couple of minutes. And if you have questions, please feel free to send it to me in the chat, and I will go through as many of them as I possibly can. Also, just a quick reminder that this is the first part of a two-part series. So we will also be hosting a program on November 3rd in person at 7 p.m. at the Jewish Federation building with Michael Koplow, who will then be helping us to understand what happened after the Israeli elections are over. And even if you've registered for tonight, we do still ask that you register for that program, because while you're welcome to come to both, you can come to just one or the other. So we will be sharing that link for how you can register for that. I think that was all my housekeeping. So with that, let me introduce our guest tonight. David Halperin is the CEO of Israel Policy Forum, an organization committed to educating community leaders and mobilizing policymakers in support of pragmatic proposals to advance the goal of a viable two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, consistent with Israel's security. He was instrumental in the rebirth of Israel Policy Forum's work in 2012, expanding the organization's policy research, government relations, community education, and young professional programs. He has previously worked as a Middle East policy analyst at the Center for American Progress and as a reporter for Haaretz English edition in Israel. He's an alumni of the Wexner Foundation's Field Fellowship Program, and he has an MPA with a focus on international relations from Columbia University's School for International and Public Affairs, where he was a member of the International Fellows Program. He has a BA in Political Science and Judaic Studies from the University of Arizona. He's a founding board member of the Salat Treatment and Research Foundation. Originally from Phoenix, he now lives with his wife and two kids in Riverdale, New York. And you've been a guest with us before, so it's just great to be back with you, David.
Thanks, Rory, and thanks to you all, the JCRC of St. Louis and Jewish Federation, for coming together with Israel Policy Forum to unpack, preview, and review the election number 5 in a very, very short period of time, and look forward to all of your questions and to dig in. But really, thanks to you all for your partnership and interest.
So let me start off, before we get into like the meat of it. I'm kind of curious, like what's the feeling in Israel right now? I mean, is there a sense of like we're done voting? I mean, like how many times can they keep going back to the polls, or is each time kind of a new and exciting thing? Like, can you just give us a lay of like what's the feeling on the ground about a 5th election in what feels like an incredibly short amount of time?
Yeah, I think that this is a great day to answer that question, because I think until today, I mean, really until today, nobody was paying attention to this election. Yet another election. This, you could actually see the attention on the election based on how the political parties are spending their money. And the political parties, frankly, haven't been spending money. They've all saved their big push for the last 2 weeks of this campaign, which officially begins today. Today is the first night in Israel where we're first seeing TV ads. I think for those of us in the United States who are seeing endless TV political ads for like months and months on end, the notion that you only get TV ads for 2 weeks is kind of refreshing, frankly. But I think really today is the first day where you're suddenly seeing a flurry of new policy positions, pronouncements, declarations by the various parties to really stake their claim to the voters with 2 weeks to go, because really today is when anybody's beginning to pay attention. But until now, all of the news, the TikTok, the mergers, the I won't runs, all of that stuff, I think folks have not really been paying a whole lot of attention. But I think that we're now in the full court sprint of the campaign.
So let's go back before we even talk about this election. Help us understand what went wrong, or maybe not what went wrong. I don't want to frame it totally in that way, but what caused the collapse of the last government? Like, can you walk us through exactly where that broke down?
Well, I think to look at the last government, you have to look to the government before it, and then to the election before that, and to the election before that. We have a great resource. I'll use this as a plug on our website, israelpolicyforum.org/120, spelled out the words 120, where you can actually view a timeline of each one of the last elections going back for the last 4 years, and what were some of the key moments along the way. But just as a reminder, in the last election, what we had was a real political earthquake in the Habayit Yehudi faction, Yamina faction of Naftali Bennett, essentially leaving its historic alliance with other right-wing parties, and particularly with Benjamin Netanyahu, to form a government with Yair Lapid, including an Arab party for the first time in Israel's history in the governing coalition. This was a grand experiment of a remarkably broad coalition that included Arab party Ra'am on the one hand, which is a conservative but Islamist party, all the way to Naftali Bennett's party, which has its historical roots in support within the settlements, and everything in between. This was a historically broad party, but as such was incredibly weak from the very beginning. And we began to see signs of the fraying of this last government within Naftali Bennett's party, and also some fraying on the Arab side of this spectrum as well. But ultimately, with two key defections from Naftali Bennett's side of the governing coalition, led to elections being called. When elections were called, it immediately triggered the rotation from Naftali Bennett as prime minister to Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid is now prime minister until someone else is able to form a government. And so we're headed to this election number 5 in less than 4.5 years. And Yair Lapid will be prime minister until a new government is formed, meaning that after this election, if we are still seeing this ongoing political deadlock in Israel, Yair Lapid will remain prime minister, even heading to election number 6, should that be on the horizon.
And so you talked about the last government, and I want to spend a little bit more time on that, because I mean, it was an incredibly historic government, weak from the beginning, and yet I want to ask if it was successful, but I even realize in asking that question, that depends on what our definition is of success. I mean, I was really struck when I was in Israel by, and this might have just been some of the people I was talking to, but there were people that seemed to have a lot of hope around what it was to bring together these factions. And I think it was especially interesting looking at America, where it feels like America is more and more like, you can't work it all across the aisle. And then here was this grand experiment that Israel did. It didn't last too long, but it lasted longer than some people thought it would. So did it work? Like where might you put kind of the success meter on that?
I think that it depends in part on this next election and the years to come. In the short term, it's of course who you ask. Did it work in demonstrating that Israel's political nature enables for the possibility of putting the national interests ahead of political and ideological interests, to pass a budget for the first time, that Israel's actually passed a budget in 4 years and actually accomplish some meaningful steps forward? yes, it did that. But it has also really placed into question, and I think this next election and the elections to come will tell us a great deal about the legacy of this last government. Will this be the first government in which an Arab party is participating, or frankly, will it be the last for the foreseeable future? What we've seen, of course, in the collapse of this outgoing government is that Naftali Bennett, who took this dramatic gamble in moving his right-wing slate into a coalition, not only with center-left and left-wing parties, but also with an Arab Islamist party. What we've seen now is that his faction has completely disintegrated, that he is leaving Israeli politics, or at least taking a timeout. And yet he's leaving as someone who is viewed as, during his time, he set aside his ideological preferences to maintain the national interest. And I think one may, be hard pressed to think that Bennett won't at some point seek to make a return to politics, having run or having the experience of being viewed as someone who was a responsible caretaker. But what this government has also done in its aftermath is it's unleashed the forces on the far right, who are now pointing to a government in which it views many of the right-wing traditional voters having been betrayed by entering into this alliance with left-wing and Arab parties, and by looking to that betrayal, shifting their rhetoric and their positions even further to the right, to essentially make a pact with right-wing voters that, unlike the way in which Bennett betrayed your confidence in joining with the left, our positions will be so extreme that it'll be obvious and clear that there is no chance that we will betray the right-wing voters again in forming a government with the left. So what we've seen in actuality, at least on the right side of the spectrum, we could speak about the Arab parties, I'm sure, in a moment, but on the right side of the spectrum, we've seen an increase of extreme rhetoric and a dramatic rise of the religious Zionism faction that at one point had been allied with Naftali Bennett, but today has taken some political figures who have been on the margins of Israeli political discourse, like Itamar Ben-Gvir and his Otzma Yehudit Jewish Power Party, and the Noam Party, a distinctly anti-LGBTQ party, has formed an alliance with the religious Zionism and is now polling, according to the latest polls, as the third largest party in Israel's Knesset. And as a reminder, just 2 years ago, or actually 3 years ago, 2019, Benjamin Netanyahu said that Itamar Ben-Gvir would not be fit to be a minister in his government. Today, Netanyahu has been having strategic meetings with the religious Zionism slate and with Itamar Ben-Gvir personally, and it is very clear that there is no path for Netanyahu to forming a government without religious Zionism and without placing previously beyond the pale extreme figures, not only in the government, but potentially at the head of significant ministries in Israel's coalition. And that, and very much, is a backlash to the kind of what you were describing as hopeful, putting the national interest for working across differences. That too is part of the legacy, this backlash that we've seen.
So before, I'm going to ask you to unpack more of the parties, but I want to actually first spend a little bit of time talking about the individuals. Like, you started on talking about some of them. So Naftali Bennett, who had been the prime minister, who put together this coalition, who now has said that he's kind of stepping out. So we're not going to see him for a little while. Yair Lapid, where is he viewed? Let's go to him, because then I want to spend some time on Bibi Netanyahu, but maybe we'll give a chunk of time to him. But with Yair Lapid, I know, because Yair Lapid, not everyone was thrilled with the fact that he made this deal with Bennett, and also, that he kind of gave a lot more to Bennett than some people thought that he should have. And where is he kind of fitting in with all of this?
Well, just as Naftali Bennett argued he was putting the national interest first and his ideological preferences second in forming this unusual governing alliance, Yair Lapid did the same. of seats. Instead of putting himself forward as the logical prime minister, he let Naftali Bennett become prime minister with only a fraction of the amount of seats that Lapid himself had. And so Lapid also benefits, I think, in terms of the view of being viewed as putting the national interests first. I think Yair Lapid is a rather remarkable figure if you look back just in the last less than 10 years of his political career, entering the scene as a former journalist who, entered with a new party that he was the head of. When you think of parties that have come and gone in Israeli politics, like Kadima or Moshe Kahlon's party, you look to Yair Lapid and you almost would have expected that this newcomer to politics could have been a flash in the pan moment. What has been remarkable around Yair Lapid's story is the infrastructure of the political party Yesh Atid, which today is really only second to the Likud party in terms of its grassroots activism and its get out the vote abilities. Yair Lapid is the head today of a significant political operation, and he is certainly entering. What's unique about this next election in just 2 weeks is that Lapid, unlike the past elections, entering as the opposition minister or as a candidate for prime minister, but never having been viewed in that chair, he now has the benefit of entering into this election as prime minister, someone who has now forged an international agreement just a few days ago between Israel and Lebanon, someone who has met with a visiting president as a prime minister and who has been viewed as having to face some of Israel's security challenges, economic challenges. He's now can be viewed as being in that chair. What he does with it in terms of making the case that he should continue in that chair over the next 2 weeks will be a particularly interesting to note. But I think that this is someone who has moved from the margins as a journalist to a newcomer who paid his dues, so to speak, as a minister, and now from the prime minister's chair. I think when you look back at how many times that he, has either joined in alliances like he did with Benny Gantz, and even though he had the political infrastructure, put Benny Gantz in the lead, this effort of his consistently putting himself second is actually paid off in his over time building a significant political operation.
So now Bibi. So after the last election, when Naftali Bennett stepped in as prime minister, I got a call from a local, I think it was a radio station. I did an interview about the election, and at some point the reporter said something to me like, what does Bibi do next? Or like, where does he go now that he's gone? And I was like, he's not gone. Like, I don't know what makes you think. I mean, that's, again, it was like a very American view, that people lose an election and then kind of, go write their memoirs or whatnot. I mean, Bibi has been a very vocal opposition leader throughout, and I'm sure thinks that he's going to be prime minister again. Where's he sitting right now?
Right. Well, you actually were partially right, because Bibi did write his memoirs. He wrote a book.
You could do multiple things at the same time, right? Yeah.
But he wrote his memoirs in a very nice, well-timed memoir. It's actually very American, right? To write the book and then to campaign with the media attention of what you write in the book, right? So, Yediot Ahronot's holiday edition front cover is a review of his book. And so he's gotten some positive attention to his book over on the high holidays in which it was strategically released. Just as I mentioned, Lapid is entering this election in an unusual position as prime minister. Netanyahu is entering this election in an unusual position as leader of the opposition. If there is anything that is different in the last 2 weeks of this campaign from the previous rounds, we'd say very simply that the election was about Bibi yes or Bibi no. Today, the blocks of Bibi, anti-Bibi, they seem pretty darn set. It seems pretty clear who is voting for a Bibi coalition and who is not. And what Netanyahu has attempted to do is obviously criticize the outgoing government at every possible chance, but to really solidify his right-wing base of voters who are indeed in the Bibi camp. And this goes back to what I was mentioning with Netanyahu's encouraging of this alliance around the religious Zionism faction. Now, just to speak for a moment about the coalition formation process, the goal here is to reach a government of at least 61 seats, 120 seats in the Knesset. The pro-Bibi bloc right now is not polling at 61. It's just below at 59 or 60. But on the other side, Yair Lapid, his anti-Bibi bloc, is also not able to get to that magic 61, okay? The difference between the two today is that Netanyahu is entering the election day with a great deal of headwinds, not only because his numbers have consistently approached the magic number of 61, but because within the pro-Bibi bloc, within his natural partners, particularly the religious parties and the religious Zionism party, every one of those parties is very clearly in all the polls above the electoral threshold, meaning that every political party in Israel, in order to reach into the group of 120 Knesset seats, you need to have at least 3.25% of the electoral vote in order to get a minimum of 4 seats out of the 120. So all of those in the natural Bibi coalition are well above, or right now polling well above, the 3.25%. With the exception of Ayelet Shaked, we'll set that aside right now, because she may not make it. On the Lapid side, his natural parties, to be in a coalition with Yair Lapid, groups like the Labor Party, currently polling at around 5 seats, flirting with that threshold. The Merits, 5 seats. The Arab parties, that in 2015, when the Arab parties created the joint list, a combination of 4 Arab parties, they reached in the Knesset 15 seats in the Knesset. Today, they've completely splintered, with Ra'am and Balad running separately. Ra'am polling at 4 seats, right at the threshold. Balad right now looking like they won't make it. And an alliance between the other 2 Arab parties, Hadash and Ta'al, also sitting at 4 seats. And so just a few folks don't come to the polls, right, on that side of the spectrum, which Yair Lapid absolutely would need in a coalition. And not only risk not making it to the Knesset, possible that the vote share would shift, getting him over the magic number of 60. Right now, for Bibi and down for Lapid. And so there's one other dynamic that I think is worth noting, is that the religious Zionism growth, this dramatic growth to now polling as the 3rd largest party, according to polls heading into election day, I fully expect over the next 2 weeks, Benjamin Netanyahu is going to make an all-out effort to bring those voters back to the Likud, because those religious Zionist votes, those increasing extreme right voters on the polls are coming at the expense of the Likud party, meaning the Likud will enter coalition formation negotiations from a weaker position, and the religious Zionism faction at a stronger position. And BG, I think, certainly wants strong coalition partners, but not at the expense of his own Likud party. And so I think you're going to see the beginning of a shift in a lot of Bibi's rhetoric saying it's time to come home to the Likud party over the next 2 weeks.
So are there any other people that we need to be knowing about in terms of, I mean, you sort of said that it seems like with the scenarios you've laid out, we're talking about either more of a stretch for a Yair. First of all, it sounds like you're saying we're going to 6th elections. That's what I'm really hearing you say, is that sounds like the likely case. But I'm also hearing that we're talking about potentially either Yair Lapid or Bibi Netanyahu. Is there any other potential that we're seeing another candidate showing up as prime minister?
So we have to talk a bit about Benny Gantz. First, I do think that it's important the ground we've covered right now, which is the phenomenon of the far right and the growth of the far right and the danger of the low Arab voter turnout. I think those are two really important stories to be watching heading into election day. But if we're looking for other possible prime minister candidates, Benny Gantz certainly wants to be in that picture. And what Benny Gantz is arguing is that he may be able to form a coalition either without Likud or pulling in Likud defectors together with the Orthodox, something that, or the religious parties, something that Yair Lapid is unable to do. I think that is suspect that he would actually be able to form such a government, given the way that the blocs are so clearly defined and the strong, I think, pro-Bibi purity within the Likud party. There's not exactly another stream within the Likud today that is eager to abandon Benjamin Netanyahu. I think there's also another scenario which should at least be mentioned because it came in the news a couple of days ago. And this is the idea that after the election, when it comes to government formation, Netanyahu would receive the mandate to form the government from the president, and that in order to avoid having to give ministerial portfolios to the religious Zionist right-wing extremist figures, that he would strike yet another deal with Benny Gantz, with the idea that Benny Gantz could flip and go with Bibi yet again, arguing that it's in the national interest for Benny Gantz to maintain the security defense portfolios and to keep out the extreme right-wing party and individuals from Israel's government. That would be putting the national interests ahead of political interests for both Netanyahu's perspective and Benny Gantz's perspective. Okay, now, recognizing that this is something that has been discussed, what we saw a few days ago is Bibi Netanyahu very clearly stating publicly that he refuses to form a government with Benny Gantz. Okay, now why is he doing that? Because he wants those religious Zionism voters, those folks who are leaving the Likud according to the polls and going to religious Zionism, to know that they can come back to the Likud because naturally religious Zionism will be with the Likud. Okay, so his message is, don't worry, I won't abandon religious Zionism. I have no intention to do that. And it's okay, you can come back to the Likud because religious Zionism is safe. And in that way, signaling he's not. Now, is that still in the cards? I think anything is in the cards. This is Israeli politics. Over the last 5 elections, we've seen some major curveballs between what started in election number 1 with the high voter turnout to the Benny Gantz joining with Bibi unexpectedly, to Naftali Bennett unexpectedly joining with the Arab parties. Israeli politics in the last 4 years has been a wild ride. I will not say for certain that we're heading to a 6th election. I do think the winds right now are in Netanyahu's favor, predominantly because of the low voter turnout rates, at least according to the polls to this point, which demonstrate that the typical pro-Bibi bloc voter, the turnout rate right now is expected to be something in close to 80% turnout, whereas the typical anti-Bibi voter is like 10% lower than that, and brought down significantly by the low anticipated Arab vote turnout.
So with everything that you just described, and with the potential for some of the coalitions that Bibi might be looking to form, and particularly, I guess I'm thinking about the, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and I'm thinking about Noam, and I'm thinking about some of those that you've brought up. But perhaps even more broadly than that, what's potentially on the line right now, in the sense that, like, if Bibi's bringing somebody into it, like, what are the deals that are there to be made, and what are the things that we might be seeing compromise on or potentially at stake for some of these parties to enter the government?
So just to, as I mentioned, really Tuesday, with the conclusion of the holidays, began this election season. And so we saw each party announce what its political priorities will be. Benny Gantz's faction has put out a plan on diminishing crime and Jewish Arab tensions across the country, really focusing on its security chiefs as wanting to maintain the defense portfolio that Benny Gantz is in right now. Avigdor Lieberman, who's currently the finance minister, is really focused on the economy. His message is all about the economy. It's also actually about education, because of the sort of common core curriculum that he's pushing forward against opposition from the ultra-Orthodox. But if you're looking at what's at stake between, if Netanyahu is able to form this right-wing government, you have to look to what religious Zionism, this far right-wing party, announced just the day before yesterday, which is a really far-reaching effort to completely gut Israel's judiciary of any sort of checks on the power of the Israeli government. It essentially renders Israel's Supreme Court and Israel's judicial system as essentially advisory in nature. Really takes nothing that the government really needs to take all that seriously. And by the way, also promotes the notion of doing away with the law of fraud and breach of trust that currently Netanyahu is faced with in his criminal trials. This is now a core part of their plank, is to essentially remove the powers of the attorney general, to essentially make the judiciary act at the behest of the justice ministry, which of course religious Zionism is now arguing they should take on as members of the new coalition. And in some ways, it has really unmasked just how extreme their views are, and has made it a very clear choice heading into the election day between those who essentially want to gut Israel's judiciary and get a free pass for Netanyahu out of his criminal trials, and Lapid's approach, which is, of course, the exact opposite. But it is a significant challenge to how Israel's democracy functions if religious Zionism were to actually succeed in receiving the third largest vote share in the Knesset at some 14, 15 seats, and the prospect of the religious Zionism being able to demand the justice ministry would be a significant blow to Israel's core democratic institutions. I think that is very, very clear following their election promise that they've made just a day and a half or so ago. And of course, Netanyahu, seeing just how extreme this is, has said, "Oh no, it wouldn't affect my criminal trial." But of course, no prosecution is going to go forward prosecuting an individual for disobeying a law that doesn't exist. It's certainly, we're talking about not only gutting the judiciary, but we're talking, of course, about annexation being back on the table, the notion of legalizing illegal settlement outposts that's illegal according to Israel's law. This is sort of the squatting settlements in far-flung areas of the West Bank, including on privately owned Palestinian land, the goals of essentially undermining the current Israeli court cases that view those settlements as illegal, as a way, as a stepping stone towards full annexation. All of that, of course, would be back on the table as well. Of course, this is, just in terms of Israel's broader image globally, and the the same hope that you described, this remarkable coalition across the political spectrum coming together, being followed up by this, frankly, a far right coalition that would include some of the most extreme members that Israel's political establishment has ever seen at the highest levels. I think it would significantly impact the way that Israel is viewed, quite honestly.
You mentioned the criminal trials, and I wanted to just follow up because we haven't been hearing, I haven't been hearing as much about that. So is that something that has not gone away? I mean, it seemed to be a much bigger topic maybe when Bibi was running in the last elections. Can you give us like the quick summary of where that is, and is that something we should be paying attention to?
Not really, to be quite honest with you. I mean, it's an incredibly slow, drawn out process that was likely to last another 1.5 to 2 years. It is not on the front end of the of this election, other than, you know, it being part of a package of judicial reforms the far right wants to advance. Clearly, Netanyahu needs to pass something in order for this, some legislation that only a strong right-wing government could pass in order to survive politically and undo this criminal challenge. That's been the case for every election up until this point. The trial is ongoing. It is not grabbing the headlines in Israel in the same way. Netanyahu has been able to function as an ongoing politician throughout this, and if anything, throughout this election era of Israel's history, we've seen Netanyahu strengthen his support within his core Likud party. Those who have tried to challenge him from within the Likud have failed. For the few that have sought to challenge him within the Likud primaries, not only lost those primary challenges, but are now, frankly, out of the Likud altogether, or are significantly marginalized within Likud. So he's actually been able to strengthen his support through these through the sort of marginal challenges there have been. So no, and the short answer is it's still there, it's still ongoing, but it's in the background.
And let's go back to what you said about annexation coming back on the table, because I know that's, I would venture, again, this is my own bias, but I would venture to say that that's a big deal for the American Jewish community. I don't know if it's as big of a deal in Israel itself, but can you just unpack some of what's at stake with annexation? And when we talk about annexation, are we talking about complete annexation, or are we talking about partial annexations?
So let me give 2 responses, because I think that of course would have an impact on the American Jewish community and US policy and the like, but I think so too would these judicial reforms. I think that at the core of the US alliance is shared democratic values. And if the notion of our shared democratic values begins to weaken, I think that too is deeply concerning to all of us, quite honestly. So putting that aside, I think when it comes to annexation, I don't think it's on the front burner of issues, in large part because part of the Abraham Accords deal, right, in the summer of 2020, was the idea that the threat of annexation moving forward would be shelved for a period of time. Now, by those reports, the period of time was roughly 3 years, right? So we're heading into 2023, the summer of 2023, we're right around that time. And then the question will come up once we're beyond this sort of grace period that was provided. Now, there was nothing official, there was nothing sort of written down. This was a common understanding that essentially this was not canceling annexation for good, this was putting a pause on annexation. But I think that pause, from Netanyahu's perspective, could be running out, and it'll be interesting to see at that point how the countries of the Abraham Accords would respond to an Israeli government that is increasingly right-wing, that is expressing rhetoric that is possibly very embarrassing to the Arab states, if it's, you know, frankly, racist in tone. It is unclear how that sort of government, I don't think it would lead to a rupture with Abraham Accords states in the short term. Ultimately, these accords are about shared strategic interests, which endure. But it will be interesting to see how the Abraham Accord states would respond to the notion of annexation being put back on the table. I think that rather than a formal annexation process being first advanced, the first things that you would see is the notion of retroactively legalizing these settlements that have been built contrary to Israeli law, to legalizing them according to Israeli law before applying Israeli sovereignty on them. That's, I think, the first step, which would essentially be de facto annexation of a whole new swaths of territory. Just to remind all of you, in all of the talk about settlements, since the signing of the Oslo Accords, the Declaration of Principles in 1993, only 2 new settlements have been established in the West Bank. All of the notion of settlement construction has been expansion of existing settlements that were built before 1993, with the exception of all of these illegal outposts, of which there's more than 100, which could be of varying size. Some are built as extensions to existing settlements, sort of connected by the electrical and plumbing and so forth to an existing legal settlement, but that a neighborhood of that settlement is built illegally. Some of those illegal outposts could be someone with a tent and a few sheep, right? So when I say 100, it sounds like quite a lot. There are varying degrees and varying styles, but I think that is the first, step that we would see in terms of advancing de facto annexation. And then, yes, I think if we had a right-wing government, it would be only a matter of time before it began advancing that notion of full annexation. Yeah.
So if we do start to think that there's a chance of 6 elections, which I know you're not making any kind of predictions, but part of the challenge I think we saw with the last cluster of elections was they happened so close together that it's hard to really see a lot changing from one to the next. So if we aren't able to see a government formed in this election, then what are we looking at? Like, what has to change before we start looking at a 6th election? And maybe this is a corollary or somewhat separate question, but I'll throw it in with this also. Like, is this forever going to be Israel's fate, that they're going to always do like 3 elections at a time? Or, how does Israel kind of move forward in this democracy that functions, more than 2 weeks at a time?
Yeah. I think Israel has been stuck by a sort of perfect storm of political phenomenon. I think that one ingredient to this storm, of course, is Netanyahu himself, and just the political baggage that he now has with all of those on the anti-Netanyahu bloc, including his historic ideological partners and Avigdor Lieberman and people like Avigdor Lieberman and Gideon Sa'ar, people who he has formed governments with in the past, like Benny Gantz. All of these folks in this anti-Netanyahu bloc have a history of either being jilted or by Netanyahu, or frankly not willing to go there. That is what is at its core been locking Israel's political system into this paralysis, is just the political character of Bibi Netanyahu. As I said before, the Likud party has shown no signs of abandoning him. There are always some. There was some after the first election when Netanyahu couldn't form a government, said, this is Bibi's end. And they said that after the second. And they certainly said that when this government was formed and he was sent to the opposition. And yet Bibi remains as strong as ever within the Likud party. I do not see him being abandoned by the Likud. I will say that we have seen a few surprises, as I mentioned before, in this election era. And I have no doubt there will be some additional surprises for us to watch out for. But I think that at this moment, if you took Bibi Netanyahu out of the scene and had literally anybody else leading the Likud party, you would likely see a relatively stable right center-right Israeli government that would likely have very wide margins with considerable stability. Adding to the ingredients of this perfect storm, there's a terrific analysis right now in the Times of Israel by Haviv Rediger, who writes about the research of Shani Moore at the Israel Democracy Institute about the impact of the electoral threshold, that 3.25% I mentioned before. I recommend checking that analysis out. But essentially in 2014, a law was passed to raise that threshold from 2% to 3.25%, with the goal of marginalizing extreme voices that couldn't actually get into the Knesset. That was the idea, was to reward the stronger parties. But what it did actually is force the larger parties to essentially work to ensure that the marginal voices got over the threshold, right? In order to ensure that no votes were wasted. And so rather than marginalizing extreme voices, it's given rise to more extreme voices. And that is also now adding to this political paralysis when the more extreme voices are unwilling to consider the idea of compromise on ideological platforms for a national interests of a broad-based government. And so you add those kinds of ingredients together, and you see a genuine political paralysis. Now, I'd even argue that should Netanyahu form a government with his classic partners on the right, and we avoid a sixth election, it probably is only a matter of time. I mean, it's unclear that he could actually run a stable government, even of his natural partners on the right, with 61, especially not with the kind of, frankly, not only unsavory, but unpredictable characters within the religious Zionism, who will be demanding considerable influence in such a government. And so even if we stave off the sixth election for some time, I think Israel's political, let's say, paralysis or crisis, or this era of political upheaval, I'd argue is not going to conclude at election number 5.
It's not quite comforting, but
well
so speaking of political upheaval, so the thing we haven't spoken about, I know we're talking about Israeli elections, but I can't help but remember that the Israeli elections are going to come just before America's having elections. And while we're not having a presidential election, we're talking about a third of the Senate, the entire House, some other significant offices that are also up. Do you see any potential impact to both of these in terms of, I mean, obviously, Israel's always a topic in American elections as well, particularly in Congress. It's been a huge, I don't want to say dividing force, that's not the word that I mean, but it has been a growing divide in terms of the partisanship between Democrats and Republicans and debate around stances on Israel. Do you see the American election both being impacted by the Israeli elections, or Israel being impacted by a changeover in Congress or whatever might be happening here in America?
Not really, to be quite honest with you. I mean, I think certainly I'm no American political analyst necessarily, but I think that this election is really about domestic issues. I don't think the election in Israel is actually going to impact the U.S. race in any meaningful way. I think if we saw a changeover from Democrats to Republicans in the House, you know, I don't think we're going to see any significant change with regard to U.S. support for Israel and any significant shift. I think that you know, we have not seen a significant shift even from Trump to Biden. I mean, we have seen a couple of significant shifts, but not that are impacted by the House or Senate. For example, Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Biden has not reversed that, has not opened up a consulate for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and he has maintained essentially that policy shift. He has not reversed recognition of the Golan Heights. He's continued around what Trump said, and I don't expect that to change. What he changed in terms of the Trump approach is that he renewed funding for Palestinian NGOs through USAID. He renewed funding for East Jerusalem Hospital Network. He renewed funding for UNRWA, the Palestinian refugee agency that administers health, food support, and education for Palestinian refugee camps. Those things were shifted, but they had already been mandated by Congress previously. I don't expect any significant change. There's no change to things like the demands of Palestinians abide by end their payment, the Martyrs Payments Program, incentivizing terrorism against Israel. Nothing in that respect has changed from Republicans and Democrats, and I don't expect it would in the near term. In terms of like the growing divide between Democrats and Republicans, certainly among progressive Democrats and let's say, hard right Republicans, or however you want to frame it, on Israel, there's a significant divide. Is that actually leading towards significant legislative change at this moment? I don't think so, not at all, really. I think the broad-based support for Israel's security needs still remain quite strong. And the Biden administration, frankly, has not made the Israeli-Palestinian issue a priority amidst a lot going on in other places in the world, as you well know.
So maybe as we start to wind down, to bring us back to, when we started and when I introduced you, we talked about how Israel Policy Forum's one of the descriptions, I won't try to categorize it too much because I'm not qualified to, but one of the descriptions that I read was about your work in advancing the goal of a viable two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm going to venture a little bit far afield from specifically the elections, but just in the sense that with everything that we've really spoken about today, I mean, you just mentioned that this hasn't been a priority of the Biden administration. This hasn't really been one of the big issues that we've talked about coming up for the variety of parties, maybe with some exception of where annexation could potentially play a role, or the legalization of the outposts could potentially play a role in some of that. So maybe just a couple of words about like what is the path? I mean, that's certainly been a major topic in the American Jewish community, I think far more so than what I've heard in the Israeli community. What is the path in that? Not the whole path of the entire solution, but even just to see, does that come back as a major topic? And I'll say even, I'll name the fact that with just today, I got an email talking about hosting this program where somebody said, well, why are we working with an organization that supports a two-state solution? That's not where we are anymore, which I thought was interesting because for a long time that was like the du jour of the American Jewish community when others weren't talking about it. So, is there a future here?
I certainly hope so. I think that it's important to not only talk about the objective, the goal, as you mentioned, of a two-state outcome. I think it's important to talk what we identify at our organization as our vision statement, which is Israel as secure, Jewish, and democratic. And without a two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it will be impossible for Israel to maintain its security, its status as a homeland for the Jewish people, and its status as a democracy for all of its citizens. And it is clear that the political leadership and the political circumstances today do not allow for anything resembling negotiations that would resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today, it is a question about preventing the diplomatic option from being removed from the table, because removing that option for the table essentially is a direct threat to Israel's ability to maintain what its Declaration of Independence speaks about, which is the notion of a country that is both a Jewish state and a democratic state, providing security for its citizens. And so today it's not about advancing negotiations. It's not about high-minded resolution around borders and refugees. Unfortunately, today the political circumstances are nowhere near that. But what it is today is to ensure that future diplomatic options are not removed from the table through actions on the ground that could really threaten, again, any future viability. Now, do I believe that it will come back? I certainly wouldn't be as committed as I am if I didn't believe that not only can it come back, that it must come back, because ultimately there are two peoples between the river and the sea who have strong national identities and who have no desire to be in a single country, and who I do not believe there will be another framework that could remotely satisfy the core interests of either side without there being some form of a two-state outcome that would provide for the self-determination and national rights of both Israelis and Palestinians. My hope is that policies can be advanced that would not prevent this, or would not create the situation from enhancing violence among the people, and policies would be advanced that would preserve the option of two states rather than close the door, so that we can get back to that realization of the need to enable two peoples to fulfill their national identities in two states rather than in one, in a way that again would threaten the notion of secure, Jewish, and democratic. I believe that will come back because it will be clear that choice is on the table. I think it's important and an imperative that we work to advance policies that can bring that back to the fore without violence that unfortunately we're already seeing begin to rise with the recent events in recent weeks. And so that would be my sort of long-winded answer.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate also just ending on the hope that I hear in you in that. And we'll see. I mean, if there's one thing that I'm taking from this entire conversation, it's that we can't bet on anything yet. And I mean, I remember after the last election, so not only, like I said, people thought Bibi was gone, which of course wasn't true, but also people were really scared because they saw Naftali Bennett as more extreme than Bibi. And I think, what Naftali Bennett pulled together in that government was a surprise. And I think we've learned that we have no idea what to expect. And so that means anything is possible. And maybe that's always been the message of Israel, was that it was always about making the impossible possible. And we've just yet to dream of more.
Look, I guarantee you, if just a few short years ago, when we were after election number 1, if we were to tell ourselves after that 2015 election and Netanyahu, if you go to our election site, there's a great link there where, it's after election number 1 in this cycle, and the link to a CNN article that says Netanyahu declared the winner of Israel's election, set to form the next government. Okay, and if you would have told those of us reading that article that in a few years, right, we're going to be reading yet the 5th election in a shorter period of time, and Yair Lapid, the center-left Yair Lapid, who's going in front of the United Nations declaring support for 2 states amidst this what has been viewed as a right-wing shift of the Israeli public, would be the prime minister of Israel heading into this election, and could very well be the prime minister for quite some time should this political paralysis continue. Israel's political system is full of surprises. There are so many factors to consider. I have no doubt that there is something that is going to shake the system in the next couple of weeks that we haven't even talked about. It is that, and that's what we'll all be watching for in the next couple of weeks.
Well, thanks, David. And that's a great plug to say that this is why the conversation doesn't end here, and that everything that we don't know is about to happen, we'll talk about on November 3rd after it's happened, and we'll say, look back at this recording at all the things that we had no idea was coming. So in the chat, there's a link to register. Michael Koplow is coming to St. Louis and we'll do some analysis after the election. I'm sure even between November 3rd and then, maybe a month later, there might even be more analysis, but we'll take what we can get from what we'll know at that time. I just want to thank you again, David, for taking time out of your evening and for having this conversation. And just so grateful to Israel Policy Forum for all of your analysis and wisdom and sharing with us. Always grateful for this partnership. And appreciation again for the Israel Center at the Jewish Federation for joining with us at the JCRC to host the program tonight. And we look forward to all of you coming back in person on November 3rd to continue this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you all. Stay tuned. Bye.